So earlier this week, I covered my Intercept colleagues Sharon Lerner and Mara Hvistendahl's interview with EcoHealth President Peter Daszak, where they questioned him about the group's involvement with gain-of-function coronavirus research in Wuhan, China, among other things. Let's listen to some of that. Well, the scientist at the center of the lab leak controversy is a man named Peter Daszak. He's the head of an organization called EcoHealth Alliance, and he's gotten tens of millions of dollars over the years for research into coronaviruses and other pathogens. Since 2005, he's been working closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Starting in 2014, his organization, with NIH funding, collaborated on research there that involved gain-of-function research. We also know that in 2018, Daszak applied to DARPA for a grant to fund a project that would work to insert furin cleavage sites into the spikes of SARS-related viruses. Now, that research was never funded, but we don't know for sure whether any of it was ever performed. It matters because the furin cleavage site found in the virus that created this pandemic is what's so unique about it, and it's what scientists initially flagged as evidence that it was likely made in a lab. Peter Daszak played a leading role tamping down discussion of the lab leak theory by secretly organizing a group of scientists to send a letter to The Lancet debunking the idea. Now, at The Intercept, we've repeatedly reached out to Daszak. At one point, he responded through a press secretary, but generally hasn't responded at all. In late February, he finally agreed to speak to reporters Sharon Lerner and Mara Hvistendahl, who've been doggedly on this story since the beginning.
Well, joining us now to take a deeper dive into what that interview revealed is reporter for The Intercept, Mara Hvistendahl. Mara, welcome to the show. So tell us what the big bombshells were. I mean, Ryan did talk about this the other day on his radar, and so we did learn some things like, you know, maybe it did really come from, maybe there was some actual funding of this, and, you know, you seemed to be very vague, but then kind of flip-flop a little bit. So tell us the big bombshells.
Well, Sharon and I have been reporting on documents from this grant from NIH to Peter Daszak's team that funded bat coronavirus research in China. We obtained thousands of pages of grant documents through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. And we've spent the past few months digging into those documents, poring over them, looking at what they say and don't say. And we've had many questions for Daszak himself, who was the principal investigator on the grant. And then finally, earlier this month, he agreed to speak with us.
Yeah, I was interested when Ryan was discussing this the other day. I thought it was interesting that he, you know, the question, so it's not, it wasn't funded, but there's a question of, well, you know, how much of this research could have been conceivably been worked on already, even to get to the point where they would request funding. And then he kind of just claimed to not know or have no idea when you got into that category. So did you find him I think he was forthcoming at first, and then became less forthcoming, or maybe just generally didn't know, which is its own problem, not knowing. But what did you make of his of his tone and of his candor?
Well, just to be clear, we're talking about two different grants, and these stories have been playing out at the same time. And so, you know, naturally they're conflated in some people's minds. But there's the NIH grant to Daszak's group, which included the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That was funded, and that contained experiments that were highly concerning, but are, according to the documents, in terms of the experiments that have actually been described so far, because we're still waiting for some documents, could not have led to the pandemic. And then also last fall, a group of internet sleuths called Drastic obtained an unfunded proposal for highly concerning research. And this is the research that Ryan described that involved the insertion of furin cleavage cells into coronaviruses. So as you know, Daszak said again and again to us, it was not funded. Nonetheless, as far as I know, he has not gone on the record talking about this grant until our interview. So we had quite a lot of questions for him. He maintains that the research was not done, even in any kind of preliminary way to explore it for the purpose of this proposal. He also kind of shoved off some of our questions on one of his collaborators on the proposal, who was Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, and said, if you want to know more about that part of the proposal, you need to go ask him. Unfortunately, Ralph Barrick did not respond to our questions.
Right, and so that does seem to be the key kind of open question that still needs to be answered, or two key open questions. One, within the NIH grant, what research was done that hasn't both been specifically described in reports back to the NIH and also been released to the public. So what do we still not know? But then two, and perhaps related, was some of that being done in order to prepare for this DARPA grant that they applied for. And I'm just curious for your kind of sense on whether you think there might be some there, and also what you made of his initial claim that doing this type of research was beyond the pale, was the term he used, and then later, by the end of your interview, defending the necessity of doing that research and saying that the only reason it wasn't done is that it was too expensive, according to DARPA.
Yeah, well, to make very clear, there is so as far as we know, there is no evidence to suggest that the unfunded DARPA work was done under the NIH grant. Project Veritas released a video saying that this was the case, and there is absolutely no evidence to support that. So I consider that a conspiracy theory, and I know it's become a loaded term when we talk about the origins of the coronavirus, but there is a lot of misinformation that is floating around. On the other hand, the fact that this work was proposed in the first place is highly concerning. My interpretation of Daszak saying it was beyond the pale was that our suggestion that they would insert a furin cleavage site into a coronavirus was beyond the pale. And when we pressed a bit, we went back to him several times, like, what did you do before you proposed this work? Has anyone done this work? Has the Wuhan Institute done this work? And he maintained that he has a different definition of the work that was done under the grant. But Sharon and I have done a lot of going back and forth with scientists about these grant documents, asking them, what do you think of the experiments that are described in them? And many people are concerned about that particular proposal. And we're in an unusual situation where you have a group of internet sleuths who released a document that initially was not verified by other people apart from Project Veritas. And that document has nonetheless changed the minds of some scientists and has really changed the debate. And that is why we felt that we needed to ask Daszak about it.
And he was defensive. He was saying that, in general, correct me if you disagree with this characterization, but I think in general, he was defending this research like this as necessary as part of our pandemic preparedness, or inventing therapeutics, vaccines, understanding how to deal with these kinds of pathogens, and which I find interesting, because we're concerned that this research could create a pandemic, and also there's not a lot of evidence, I don't think, that actually this research has made us better prepared. The therapeutics, the vaccines we've gotten for COVID, for instance, to have nothing to do with any of this research. So it's interesting that he strikes an entirely defensive tone, defending sort of ideologically doing this kind of thing is necessary without evidence that it is.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that is his perspective on the research, and you're right that there are many scientists who push back and questioned whether gain-of-function research in particular has ever led to major breakthroughs in terms of whether it's needed in terms of our understanding of infectious diseases. But I think it's important to understand that there was a long-standing debate over whether to do certain types of risky experiments that dates back to well before the pandemic, and that there were essentially two camps within the scientific community. One that was primarily virologists who do these experiments, and who argued, just like Daszak did to us, that we need to do this work in order to better understand viruses, in order to prevent the next outbreak. And the other camp argues that we could have caused a pandemic. And so all that debate was there before it got mixed up in partisan politics. It was not a Republican or Democratic issue before the pandemic. And now it's, of course, much more heated. The stakes are much higher. And the question is still there. We don't know the answer yet. What we are trying to do is stick very close to what information we have, what are the facts, what can we definitively say has happened with this grant. And so that's why you see kind of incremental reporting. I mean, we've done over a dozen stories at this point on this grant, but little by little, we're learning a lot more about it.
And we have to run, but real quickly, I just wanted to ask again, the Ralph Baric situation seems incredibly fascinating to me, that he would say, well, look, okay, I don't actually know if I can't say whether or not Ralph did some of this work that you're talking about that would have involved the furin cleavage site. Were you surprised that he kind of tossed responsibility over to his colleague there? And what's your guess on whether or not we're going to be able to get him to go on record?
Yes and no, because something similar happened in a debate. It was actually a very fascinating debate that was convened by Science magazine in September over the origins of the pandemic. And the DARPA proposal had just been released ahead of the debate, so it came up. And one of Daszak's collaborators, Lin-Fa Wang, also kind of passed it over to Baric. And what's notable about Ralph Baric is that he signed one of the open letters by prominent scientists saying that actually a lab leak needs to be on the table and we need a full investigation of the origins of the pandemic. So even he's one of the world's leading coronavirus researchers, if not the leading researcher. He has actually been fairly upfront about the risks of doing this research. And so I hope that he responds to our questions. We would love to interview him as well.
Yeah, that's a huge implication if it did potentially come out of North Carolina rather than Wuhan. And I think we should be investigating both leads, right?
No, I don't believe it came out of the university.
Well,
I don't think that's on the table.
So you're not even going to investigate that. I mean, that seems strange to me that you've got a guy who's saying that his colleague maybe actually did do this sort of research in order to get the grant money, and you're not going to even follow that lead?
He was saying that Baric's lab, so Baric was the one who wrote that part of the proposal and who proposed doing that work. To me, it's unclear where the work happened. And actually, I would cut this
So
short.
if it's unclear, then
I'm
investigate
not.
Right. So the work might have been done in Wuhan, right? Because they were collaborating with Wuhan, and so they're passing viruses back and forth. They're how does that work? Was there some of it being done in North Carolina? Or not this type of work, but is there a research lab there that could be a place that some of that work would be done?
Ralph Baric does have a lab that is working on coronaviruses there. That's correct.
Right. Gotcha.
Well, Mara, thank you so much.
I would. Yeah.
You can finish your thought if you have something.
No.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Got to get Ralph Baric on. Dr. Baric, if you're watching, open invitation to join us on Rising. But yeah, Mara, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.